Please welcome Matteo Mirolo, now Director of Strategy and External Relations at what many of you know as Breakthrough Energy Contrails, or Reviate, but which in exciting news is relaunching today as contrails.org. Matteo brings a real passion for sustainable aviation. He's been at the forefront of crafting strategies on deploying e-fuels and mitigating aviation's non-CO2 impact, most recently in the context of the Refuel EU regulation. At contrails.org, Matteo is on a mission to help turn contrail science into climate action by accelerating industry-wide adoption of contrail management. With that, please join me in welcoming Matteo to lead what promises to be a timely and insightful discussion. So please, Matteo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Yeah, people knew us as BE, Breakthrough Energy Contrails, Breakthrough Energy, Reviate. It's like the Egyptian goddesses that had a lot of different names. Yes. And now we have one, which is contrails.org, and got me a free vest, so I'm grateful for that. We remain the same with a new identity. So we remain a non-profit aimed at propelling contrail research into climate action. We remain part of the Breakthrough Energy platform. We remain a collaborative and open source effort that can only work in full collaboration with all of you. We have 3 pillars of work. One is the science pillar, or research, where the aim is to continue coordinating, supporting, sponsoring strategic research to continue improving the models, the predictions, the measurements of contrails, so as to equip all of you with the kind of knowledge and science you need. The second pillar is technology, where we will continue improving and proving the feasibility at scale of contrail management by developing the open source models, tools, and protocols that are required, working with airlines, working with ANSPs, continuing to work towards larger and larger scale trials. And then finally, and last but not least, certainly adoption, where we want to keep raising the awareness, which is all credits to the great work done by the organizing team today. This is a conference that really does this job of raising awareness on the impact of contrails, but I would say even more importantly, the great potential there is regarding solutions. Resolving the system level hurdles, we've mentioned that, whether it's on the economic front, whether it's on the air traffic control front, whether it's even on the psychological front. How do we continue to look at this from a systems thinking lens and not just from a purely technical lens? And then finally, how do we foster incentives to drive adoption? I think this is the million-dollar question that we all need to think about. Yes, so more important is come to find me at the break if you want to talk about what we do, but more than anything, nothing changes apart from the logo. We remain the same. You haven't come here to listen to me, you've come here to listen to the panelists, so let me give a really quick introduction to the topic we have today. The title is one that we often find in panels talking about climate and aviation. It's carrots and sticks. Incentives for contrail management. So those of you who've been schooled in France know that the first thing we do is we try to explain the terms of the subject. So just to make sure we're on the same page, let's define. The subtitle says the EU just introduced mandatory monitoring, reporting, and verification of contrail warming from airlines. Will the new MRV rule make a difference, or do we need voluntary action? What do we need? What do we mean by make a difference? I think we could say increase the priority level towards demonstration, or, for example, increase the desire for adoption. What do we mean by incentives? In economic theory, you could say this is about getting an economic agent, a rational economic agent, to want to do something. So how do we go from a net cost to a net benefit on contrail? And how do we generate an added value around it? And I think this is really what we're here to discuss. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce my panel, starting with Andrew Chen, who is a principal, or the principal, on aviation decarbonization at the Rocky Mountain Institute. Welcome, Andrew. Then Anna Stratton, Associate Director for Aviation at the ClimateWorks Foundation. Thank you, Anna. Dimitar Nikov, never far. The policy officer working on aviation at DG Clima, the Director General for Climate Action of the European Commission. Jan Markus Lueckhof, Senior Expert on Sustainable Aviation at Deutsche Post DHL Group. Thank you. And Nuala Doyle, Policy Officer at the NGO Opportunity Green. Thank you for having joined us on stage. So, as we discussed, I'd like to start with giving each of you a chance to introduce yourselves a bit more fully, and to tell the audience what you want them to take away from the rest of this panel. Give them a bit of a guidance as to what they should be paying attention to. Let's start with Nuala.
Is that working? Brilliant. Yeah, thanks very much, Matteo, and very excited to be here. My name is Nuala Doyle, and I work at a London-based NGO called Opportunity Green, where we use law, policy, and economics to tackle the climate crisis. In my role, I work on both aviation and shipping decarbonisation, particularly with companies from both sectors who are leading the way on decarbonisation. In terms of what I want people to get out of this, I think we all know that both the CO2 and non-CO2 impacts of aviation are significant, and we need to act to mitigate them with a corresponding urgency. And we are seeing some positive steps. Obviously, we've now got the intra-EEA MRV for non-CO2 emissions, and we've heard today about a number of voluntary programmes that are already happening as well. But I think my key message would be that this issue won't be responded to with the urgency required if we're just leaving it to voluntary action. So I think strengthening of regulations to take forward contrail mitigation at speed and scale are really important. So looking forward to 2027, really needing to see that MRV expansion to international emissions, and that being a really great place to start to lay the foundation for joined-up action across the sectors that we can then see further action happening.
Thank you, Nuala. I promised each of you, I warned them, that I would have one tough question for each. Let's see if this is tough enough. But do you think we would have gotten anywhere on SAF if we hadn't had any voluntary action, Nuala?
Is in if we just left it to voluntary action?
No, if we had left it only to regulation without any voluntary action.
That's a really good question. I think it does take both. I think, it is really important to have those leading companies that are taking action on themselves, but ultimately we do need that regulatory framework to send a cross-sector demand signal to really kick forward an industry. And so I don't think we would have the scale we do have, but I think we definitely would be seeing action.
We'll go to Jan next.
Sure. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jan Lueckhof. I work for DHL Group in the Corporate Development Department, responsible for sustainability in aviation in general. So I would say about 80 to 90% of my time actually goes to sustainable aviation fuels, but also contrails is a topic that is more and more on the radar. DHL Group operates roughly 300 aircraft globally. We have a big hub in Leipzig, Germany, and we predominantly fly cargo at night. So you can imagine that this topic is especially of relevance for us. If you then, start to calculate what the ETS impact might be in a few years from now, once this is priced, a few people tend to get nervous. So my job is basically now to assess the situation, what is in store for us, what is coming towards us, what can we do about it. I would say the main takeaway, Matteo, is we feel like right now is a time where there's still a lot of discussion when it comes to how do we put that into a meaningful policy, and we can still shape that policy and make it effective but also fair to all the participants. as DHL Group, tend to not believe that the ETS is the right place. We can maybe dive into that a bit deeper later on. But at the same time, we also hear a lot from, let's call it the broader airline community, voices that say, well, we've heard the words uncertainty, a couple hundred times today. So this seems to be so uncertain. Let's postpone the whole thing for another 10 years and let the scientists work it out until we know what we're doing, right? And I'm afraid that this might be a position of quite a few airlines out there, and I don't think that this is the right way to go. And my wish would be that that we can find a place in between that makes sense for the climate and that shares the burden between all parties fairly. And first and foremost, actually, I'm here to learn about the science and about the latest developments to shape our our internal views on that issue and find the best way to go forward. And now I'm cautiously looking forward to the tough question.
I mean, you've been such a diplomat that it's difficult to find an angle. I'm looking. Okay.
I'm sure you manage.
So you have Ursula von der Leyen in front of you in the form of Dimitar Nikov. What do you tell?
Love that picture.
Sort of, with a bit of imagination. What do you, in a nutshell, what do you tell her as to why you, to quote you, tend to not agree that contrails should be solved through an integration in the ETS? What's your pitch?
Not quite sure if Ursula is the right person to actually go deep into the topic with. First and foremost, I think I would tell her, please try to fix single European sky first. That should be the basis of all of that. And then secondly, in a nutshell, and I'm happy to explain a bit further later on, I would say it's about an optimization problem for the entire airspace. It's not any single airline trying to find the best routes to trying to mitigate ETS impact. It's an entire airspace solution that needs to happen, and that must not only include ETS flights but all the non-ETS flights as well that fly in the same airspace.
We'll come back to this one.
I hope so.
I'm sparing you from a second difficult question, and we go to Dimitar. Please.
Yes. So hello to all. Thanks for the invitation. Very good to be here and to see so many people interested in this topic. From my side, so my background is climate negotiations, so a lot of diplomacy and economics. So this is new for me as well, but I have this appetite in science, so I'm excited all the time, basically looking at different publications, and this work is just incredible in terms of science. So basically, what we have right now is the MRV, and the way we approach it from DG Clima, we don't like to see the sticks. We like to see it as a carrot rather than a stick. Basically, indeed, we need to, in 27, we need to have a report, then eventually, if appropriate, to have an impact assessment to see if a pricing through the ETS is of relevance. Nevertheless, we're not there yet. So for the time being, we see it as very much as a learning exercise, the MRV, knowledge building, and this is what we would like to get out of it in the first place, and more knowledge. And then we'll see, and I know it can sound a little bit frustrating because we are here discussing a lot of contrail avoidance and solutions, mitigation solutions. Nevertheless, the stage where we are in terms of policy making, at least within the EU, is learning and maybe doing soon. Another carrot that we're having is acknowledging how the MRV is functioning through the Innovation Fund. So the Innovation Fund is this ETS fitted tool that basically allows to finance highly innovative projects in terms of mitigation. And non-CO2 is being mentioned in the methodology of the Innovation Fund. And basically it's a methodology that evolves every year. The different calls under the Innovation Fund are evolving every year as well. So we do also hope at some point to see projects being selected there as well in terms of mitigation of non-CO2 in general.
Dimitar, let's look at a carrot. Imagine a big carrot, uncooked. It's like a stick, right? So what do you say to those who argue that the MRV is a first step towards pricing?
Oh, it's a fair point. I mean, it always starts from somewhere. You have to have more understanding, knowledge. You have to have a process to get to know a topic before deciding anything on this topic. And we are very neutral in terms of approach on mitigations. Basically, it can be contrail avoidance. I mean, I'm hearing a lot on contrail avoidance, and it seems not difficult to reach, including in terms of price. But there is also the jet fuel on which you can work through lowering aromatics, etc. Yeah, so there are different solutions out there, and we don't want to go faster than the music. So to people that are saying you're just cooking us and you're preparing something for us, well, it's all in the directive, what co-legislators decided, basically. We are doing right now an MRV, then we're going to have a report, and yes, and then political decision on the next steps.
Okay, so the carrot is cooking, slowly.
Well, okay. It depends how you define cooking, but okay.
We'll get into this.
Right.
Andrew, you're next.
Thanks, Matteo. I'm Andrew Chen. I'm the principal for aviation at RMI. If you're not familiar, RMI is an independent, nonpartisan, US-based nonprofit founded in 1980 as the Rocky Mountain Institute. So if you ever see me on a Zoom or Teams call with the Rocky Mountains in my background, you know why. Our work in aviation has been focused on how do we accelerate net zero aviation. And historically, we've been heavily focused on the SAF market. This includes work to create the framework for a SAF certificate, or the environmental attribute certificate associated with the use of SAF, and ultimately arming corporates and the corporate travelers and users of aviation services and air cargo to be able to actually invest in the transition and share in those costs in return for the ability to reduce their footprint and therefore help reduce the impact that they make from traveling. In recent years, since 2022, we've been convening something called the Contrail Impact Task Force, which I would encourage everyone in the room, if you've not yet taken part in meetings or become a member of our distribution list, please come and find me, or please take a look at us online. We exist to convene stakeholders across this entire value chain. So the airline industry, OEMs, air navigation service providers, research, tech developers, and policymakers on this topic to share best practice, to advance solutions, and to ultimately address the costs of contrails in addition to CO2. So we really see this, and I think I'd like to call it Nikhil for doing a great job of making sure that caveat is very clear, that we also share that view that the work and the progress, voluntary, carrot or stick, on the topic of contrails cannot be done in place of or instead of the efforts to decarbonize aviation. Coming to the question today about what is better, a carrot or a stick approach, and where does the MRV fit in here? We've clearly seen with the development of the SAF market and the progress that's been made to date, not done yet, and still a lot more work to go, a basket of measures approach, and one where we've seen real value from both carrots and sticks in that approach. When we think about contrails and the various pros and cons that each incentive or each carrot or each stick could come with, it's fundamental that we have a way to measure these things, and we have a way to do that consistently. So in that light, the MRV is a monumental milestone and first step in that progress. And Dimitar, I think it's great to hear, your viewpoint that it is a learning process. It's something that we have to understand, does this work? But ultimately, if we're asking a sector of the global economy or a corporate who is a heavy user of aviation services to do something about this, we need a way to measure that impact and a way to measure it that actually incentivizes a change of behavior. So we really applaud the work, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with the ecosystem and partners in the room here to develop tools to allow for more and more players in the aviation value chain to play their part and actually contribute to reducing contrail impacts.
Andrew, you mentioned your work around corporates. Can arming corporates be harming to the contrails effort we're doing? In other words, Nuala was talking about the role, the supremacy of policy in this space. Is there any risk that this voluntary approach may be distracting us or serve as a convenient excuse to not go through the policy route?
I think part of what I think about as voluntary action in this case isn't necessarily a market-based measure, isn't necessarily purchasing and investing in certificates that relate to contrail mitigation, but ultimately it's about owning and accounting the full impact of aviation on climate. And so I think there is real value in that voluntary action. And I draw parallels to where we were 7 to 8 years ago in conversations with SAF and the SAF market. There was real value and there was real power to a voluntary industry target relating to net zero by mid-century or nearby. I don't think you can discredit that, and you have to view that as truly a voluntary approach and step that's being taken here. I think similarly, when we think about, let's say, weaponizing the corporate voice in this conversation, ultimately that first step has to be owning and accounting for your entire aviation footprint. And as we know today, there are some corporates who are starting to try and do this with very limited tools. They're using basic multipliers on top of their CO2 that they estimate from their air travel. That does not do what it needs to do in terms of incentivizing behavior change with contrail management.
Thank you very much. And Anna, you have the honor to conclude this first round.
Great. Thank you, Matteo. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Stratton, and I'm the Associate Director for Aviation at ClimateWorks Foundation. I have to admit, I spend most of my time listening to experts like the ones on this panel to really inform philanthropic strategy and funding decisions. So, Matteo, my imposter syndrome is at an all-time high, but I'm very happy to be here, and I will stay in my philanthropy lane. So very broadly speaking, climate philanthropy can take risks and invest in innovative solutions. We also have a role to play partnering with both governments and industry in order to catalyze greater action. And of course, we try and play a role to drive ambitious climate policy. And this is in part what I think makes contrails such a perfect issue for engagement for philanthropic action. As most of the sessions today have really illustrated, work remains on all of these fronts when it comes to contrails. Furthermore, philanthropy tends to focus on areas where there's a clear opportunity for positive impact, but also remaining barriers to that progress. And so I think the strong and growing interest that we're starting to see from philanthropy on the issue really reflects the general optimism and sense that this could be a really near-term climate win if we take action to mitigate contrails, but also the reality that while we've started to see the beginnings of progress, both from the voluntary side, but also regulatory, we still have a long way to go if we're really going to capitalize on this opportunity and take action this decade. So very excited to be here, really in answer to the key question, carrots or sticks. I'm going to hop on the fence and say both.
So let's drill a bit deeper on that. I think it's actually great that you're telling us you observe, because I think, as always, sometimes people talk and they listen less. And I think you have this privileged position of seeing a lot of people talking. Working with philanthropies has made me more familiar with the term theory of change, which I really like. It's a really fantastic concept of looking at how we go from a point A to point B being the desirable outcome, and sort of what is the theory of how we go from that A to B. So putting maybe your philanthropic hat on the side, and like, what are you observing as the theory of change on this very question of contrails management?
Matteo, I thought we said we were going to solve that Wednesday night when we fly
True,
out
yes.
of Reviers. I think we're starting to see the beginnings of a theory of change. I think what's becoming clear, at least from my perspective, is we are, I think, in a position now to start to see continued advancement of scientific understanding of the issue and continued coalescence around the idea that perhaps uncertainty is not where we should focus, but greater clarity, and then at the same time, in parallel, work to actually start advancing more of the policy, regulatory, and voluntary mechanisms needed. So I think before there was a bit more of the sense of, we need to wait, let's just focus on the science, but now we're starting to see a theory of change where we can actually do both at once.
So I think that's a perfect segue into the conversation, because this panel is not about uncertainty, or rather, not about scientific uncertainty, maybe more about policy, voluntary uncertainties. How do we go there? So Dimitar, I'd like to start with you, and this was our warm up. Now we're all getting a bit sweaty, and we can start the debate. Dimitar, let's start with policy. And I think, one thing that definitely one can admire in the European Commission is the fact that there is a strategy behind things. So how do you think the MRV can fit into those mitigation policies? What is the role of the MRV in the theory of change now that everyone is familiar with the term?
Okay, but again, the MRV is knowledge exercise. So this is the way it should fit into any kind of mitigation policy. It should provide a broad picture of a situation with a set of parameters that are being applied to the situation. Here, specific models, specific approach being applied, which we're not saying is the perfect one, but which is a approach that is being widely used in terms of models. What I can say that what we will need to get to mitigation policies will be some validation on basically on persistence of contrails. We discussed about uncertainties. We'll have to have a structured approach towards this as well. So the observation, the uncertainties. Google mentioned the operational challenge in terms of how you mainstream this operationally, and basically showcase how far the models are performing and what you can do with those. And I think with these 3 or 4, you can do a lot of things. And then, of course, the idea is to have, trials, let's say. So the MRV is a trial, but the thing is that there is no avoidance associated to it. So I'm just wondering how far airlines could be interested in actually using the parameters of the MRV to actually do avoidance. Why not? So this could be definitely also a useful input on which we can base policy making.
So okay, that's the theory, and so it's clear. The MRV is an experiment. There is data. It feeds into people getting more knowledge, getting more at hands with the data. Jan, how is it taken on the airline side? How are you seeing this theory in your practical worlds?
You mean the MRV as such, or?
Yes.
That's a difficult question that you should have asked earlier, maybe. First of all, I think that at least us as DHL, we welcome the MRV because it puts a lot of attention on the topic finally. I think that was sort of the catalyst, and that's probably part of the reason we're here now. It just stirs up the attention, and as I said, people are getting nervous about the possibility of pricing. We can talk a lot about the mechanics behind it and how it's set up and how it's probably not working properly right now, with needs not available and so on. So I'm not sure, and I probably leave that to others to decide how much we can actually learn from that MRV. I mean, from how I read the ETS law, the path is pretty clear. There's going to be an impact report. And depending on the outcome, there's going to be measures, which is pricing, essentially, right? So the question really is, what's going to be the outcome of the report? I mean, hopefully quite a bit of information, but the essential outcome will be, yes, there's a problem. Yes, it's significant. It's probably roughly in the order of magnitude of CO2. So yes, we need to do something about it. So yes, we need to put a price on it, however that might look like. But we believe that is pretty clear how the path forward will look like from a policy standpoint.
So a conference like this, I think, between friends, between people that are well-intentioned, is also about brainstorming and sort of coming together to form a form of consensus. What if that is, in a way, the path that you're seeing, what would make you more comfortable? How do you see policy playing a role here? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily in an idealistic scenario, but you have the MRV, it's in the law, okay, mm-hmm. It's there. You have a role to play as a stakeholder, a positive role, knowing you and DHL. What role do you think, what is the outcome you would expect that would make you more comfortable with this whole process?
I think our biggest wish would probably be to include air traffic management way more. As I said, we believe it's essentially an airspace optimization problem, and that can only really done by air traffic management. So maybe just an example, and I hope it's not too complicated, but this is what we are sort of afraid of, right? Imagine you have 3 aircraft flying through a climate-sensitive region, an super-saturated area. 2 of them are ETS flights, and 1 of them is not an ETS flight. And the 2 ETS flights will try to divert, right, if there's a price within the ETS. So they will try to divert, and airspace is congested, so only airline 1 is allowed to divert, and airline 2 needs to fly through the super-saturated area. And then maybe even the worst case, flight 3, airline 3, that is not a ETS flight, sort of uses the airspace that is now free and diverts into the super-saturated area. So in that scenario, you have 1 airline that is good to go, it has diverted, doesn't have to pay. 1 airline that wanted to divert, so did everything right, but still has to pay, and that can be significant. So we're not talking like with diversions in CO2, you need 0.5% more, that's all right. It might produce a big hit, and that can be really significant on your bill. And then worst of all, the climate has gained nothing because the non-ETS flight has just created the contrail that the ETS flight has diverted. So this is a scenario that we could see happening, and we need to avoid that. And in my mind, that can only really be done by a very, very strong integration of air traffic management. How that works in the details, I'm very happy to discuss. We're not the experts on that as well, but that's what we would look for. I mean,
I think that's a very fair point. But it's also convenient in a way, because it's putting the responsibility on someone else. So how do we make sure that then you also have your share of responsibility in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, I get that point, and I don't want to be the airline guy that tries to push all the responsibility to anybody else. Sure, make us pay for the extra fuel burn. We have just seen that's probably the biggest share of the financial impact, right? Is the OPEX, the additional fuel burn. Airlines pay for fuel, so that's probably going to be the case anyway. And don't quote me on that, but if you build up the capacity on the side of the air traffic management, software, manpower, whatever it might be, put it into a surcharge and make everyone using the airspace, not only ETS, but every airspace user, make them pay for it, just a little share, and pay for the whole deal, right? So yes, we are willing and able to take a certain financial impact, but the point is really try to distribute that impact fairly overall airspace users, and not to a single airline that might by accident create a big hit without even being responsible for it because they wanted to divert but weren't allowed to.
Okay, so we've got Jan telling us that we need a concerted approach that includes also the ANSPs and really looks at it from a system perspective. What do the rest think? Can we agree on that? Do we have already a agreed point in this panel? Any reactions? And Dimitar, you have maybe the right to reply since you were mentioned.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's my reaction. We have to be... so first, you mentioned in the beginning level playing field. and also very inclusive, not forgetting about basically main stakeholders as ATMs.
Okay, so that's one agreement.
Jan, I'll second your point on the air navigation service providers and air traffic having a much more prominent seat at the table. I think that's going to be critical from an operational standpoint, but ultimately from a system level change standpoint. And I think the complexities that I'm rolling over in my mind right now relate to who is responsible, who owns those non-CO2 or contrail impacts, and I certainly can sympathize where if you're operating in a system where there are penalties or there are incentives to perform or not perform a certain maneuver or behavior, it's a challenging environment to not be able to have control of that and know that you can actually do the things that you're trying to do to avoid a potential regulatory cost. But I also, I don't think that you can fully pass the burden on to the ANSPs and the air traffic control organizations of the world, because they have a stake here, but ultimately they're not the ones operating the aircraft. So there's got to be some shared responsibility that we can work on. I think we can continue discussing.
So what does it look like? Because I think it's clear. I'm turning a bit to see if there's any skeptical looks. Don't see any right now, but it's kind of clear ANSPs have a role. I think everybody can agree on that. What's the policy avenue? We're talking about policy here. It's easy to say, then how do we do it? For airlines, it's, okay, MRV, ETS, you've painted the scenario. What does it look like for ANSPs? What is the policy avenue, the policy theory of change to go from a place where we say they have a role to play to a point where they are incentivized to play that role and actually do it in practice? Anybody's got an idea?
I could envision an analog approach to carbon budgets where you're actually providing a trajectory and ownership of trying to hit those targets to individual airspaces or airspace management areas, but ultimately it provides the incentive. You would still need to work out what is that incentive structure, what is that regulatory structure to enforce that or to implement that change.
You wanted to come in?
Yeah, sure. Probably one of the first steps, make it a KPI also for the ANSPs, right? Make them measure it, make them publish it probably. The same goes for airlines, by the way, but we're sort of doing that through the MRV. But also for ANSPs, it's first you need to measure something before you can change it, right, and manage it. So that would be the first step, and then also just in terms of budget, I feel like a lot of ANSPs are kind of afraid that they would have to do that with existing budget and personnel, and they're just saying, well, we're already constrained and we can't, or we try to keep up with the work that we already do. Give them the resources to do so properly. So, and that takes a bit of time. You need, training for people. You need to build up, software that needs to be integrated into the existing software. Maybe data centers to build and such. So this takes a bit of time, and that will be my request. Start now to enable these organizations to actually do what we ask from them.
So I'm just turning to the room. I'm going off script here, but since we're talking a lot about ANSPs and ATC, is there any ATC or ANSP specialist or indeed representative here who'd like a right to reply on this, because maybe we'd like to include them in the conversation? Otherwise, we can come back to this in the questions. So anyways, I'm interested in your reaction.
Maybe I should just add from the organizers' side, we actually invited quite a number of ANSPs, but it seems they couldn't make it today. We can wonder about that. But then again, also, Matteo, maybe we soon should move to questions to the...
Yes,
yeah,
certainly. Okay, well, that's good to know. Of course, yes, Raymond. Do we need a microphone for?
I really appreciate your comment about single European skies being a precondition before you charge for contrails. That's really an important statement because the implementation of the Single European Skies is lagging behind a lot and creating a lot of inefficiency. So this would be important for many other reasons, but contrail avoidance could be one of the biggest reasons to go ahead much more quickly in terms of automation and technological improvement in the European airspace.
Thank you, Raymond. So we have. Yes, let's have one more comment. I think it's good we have a bit of interaction, and then we'll carry on.
Yes, very quickly to respond to what you mentioned about ANSPs. So Julien Lopez from Thales Industry. Just to let you know that tomorrow morning I will give a presentation about a project that we are leading with 9 ANSPs in the north of Europe. That's called the Borealis Alliance, including several countries in the north of Europe, including Denmark. And basically we are working into what can be done to manage contrails avoidance at airspace level. So exactly what you mentioned. So we'll give details about what we look like into, what it means in terms of operational changes, etc. Then how to make that a reality on a day-to-day reality is something else, but I will explain what we do. So just to let you know that there are some ANSP involved in such projects, including others in the UK and etc. I don't know why none of them are here today, but just to let you know, there are things going on with ANSPs.
Great. So let me try to summarize the first part of this panel. So we've talked about policy. We clear trajectory on the airline side. A lot of excitement, I think, for the MRV to also show the usefulness it provides, with some questions as to the effectiveness. But let's say everybody, I think, is looking forward to it, that in the neutral sense of the word. We talked about ANSPs. So it's indeed would be great to have maybe a deep dive on that next time we do this conference, if they come. But let's talk about voluntary now, because that was the other side, the carrot. Andrew, I'm turning to you, but indeed anyone can comment. What do you foresee as a trajectory, as again to use that word, as a theory of change on voluntary, and what form can it take? Let's try to be precise.
Yeah, and we should be clear that there are almost an endless numbers of options and scenarios that could be considered a voluntary or incentive approach here. But if I draw back to the parallel that I made earlier to the SAF market and generally to setting net zero targets for aviation and the precursors that got us there, we had to see ultimately ambition and leadership from within the industry and from within the corporate sector and the heavy users of aviation to make voluntary commitments to start to see the policy changes that followed on after that. So in this case, carrying that across to contrail management and what we don't see today, we don't see accounting and reporting of contrail impacts at wide scale, at any scale, to be quite honest. We have a small handful of corporates today that report that include that in their annual statements. The majority do not yet. And as of yet, we really don't have any airline reporting of non-CO2 until the MRV went into place earlier this year. So I see that as a preliminary first step that could be taken voluntarily as a huge momentum or as something that can gain momentum toward more effective and smarter policies and incentives. So ultimately, when we get to a place where we have the value chain saying we are willing to do more and we are willing to try harder, you can see a lot more progress with policies, and you see a lot more reception to an incentive package or a carrot package that could help that behavior. It's hard to think that you could help to incentivize a behavior change that no one wants to do or no one wants to talk about doing. So we have to start by seeing people talking about it and actually disclosing the full climate impact of aviation. When we get into the future and when we start to see these precursors in place, accurate and consistent measurement of the problem, voluntary reporting and accounting of that problem, then we get into a pretty open-ended scenario of potential incentives. There are several out there that have some merit. Some of the ones that we are interested in that could potentially turn into something, or they could be nothing. Airspace costs money to use, right? So the way that airlines set their cost optimized flight trajectory in part takes into account the use of airspace and which airspace you're flying through and how much that costs for the time period you're using that. So could there be a future scenario in which airspace charges were delineated or differentiated based on contrail avoidance? Maybe it's based on an airline having or not having a flight planning system that can allow for mitigation of contrails. Those are some options that we're thinking about. But ultimately, in these early phases, we know there will be additional cost to the avoidance trials, to the mitigation trials that exist. We've heard from Roland Berger, from T&E, that those costs are relatively limited, but they are real. And we are talking about costs for fuel that are in an industry with limited profit margins and whose costs are entirely driven by fuel. So if there is a way to incentivize these early trials, I do think it will have to do with looking at those fuel costs and trying to find ways to reduce the additional burden that may come from adopting contrail mitigation.
Okay, I want to get back to you, but first, Nuala, you made your case quite clear at the beginning. So now you've heard Andrew speak about those avenues or those possible avenues for voluntary work. Under what conditions would an NGO like Opportunity Green or indeed a climate NGO, theoretical climate NGO, look at those kind of actions in a positive way, not as a distraction from policy, but as a welcome complement to policy?
I mean, I wouldn't, I wouldn't be saying that I think they're too much of they're not a bad thing. You know, it's great to see voluntary action happening, and it is a part of the response. I think where I would raise concern is just going back to the point I made earlier about the urgency. And also, as Anna said, you know, this is a near-term climate win if we take action now. And I think that's where that regulatory piece comes in, that if at the moment, you know, a significant proportion of the climate impacts of aviation are unregulated, and, you know, for example, if we were to bring in non-CO2 emissions into the ETS as an example of a regulatory measure that could be taken, we might just see that faster action happening. I'd also just be concerned that, you know, we have seen, for example, pushback from some airlines on the expansion of the MRV to international emissions. And if we're seeing objections to monitoring, that does raise some concerns about whether wholesale voluntary action to address will happen at the speed that our response needs to be.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I'm turning to Anna. Do you have any comments on that?
I think just on your question of when might an environmental group be happy to see voluntary action, I mean, I think we're very much in that situation right now. The political reality means that what is really a very salient transatlantic issue, we are most likely going to see continued policy and regulatory leadership from Europe, and then partners on the other side of the Atlantic are unlikely to move in the next 4 years on any kind of meaningful policy or regulation. So in that vacuum, there, I think, is a real opportunity for more ambitious partners to continue that voluntary work that we've already seen good examples of, that Andrew has done a lot of work to lead already. So I think this is a prime opportunity for voluntary action that could then mean that we are in a good place when the policy environment becomes potentially more amenable to then move on to that regulation.
Great, so that was a really good teamwork. So Andrew explained what forms it could take, Nuala put the red lines, and Anna gave the rationale behind that. Great, so I think we're ready to go a bit deeper. Andrew, back to you. How do we convince an airline, and Jan, you're next, but how do you convince an airline to report? Nuala made this great point. If they're already complaining about the MRV, sorry for the simplification, but I think you see what I mean, why would they suddenly find an interest in reporting something, especially outside of Europe where they're not mandated to do so?
Yeah, I think that's where efforts and maybe voluntary action outside of the industry become really important. So if the major customers of an airline or an operator are saying to them, I want to report my full aviation impact, and I have no way to do that without the information from you, then that's a necessary first step. Or, ultimately, if a company is hoping to invest in and buy certified mitigation outcomes that we heard about earlier today that relate to contrail avoidance, well, it's pretty hard to claim a reduction from somewhere in a company's scope 3 without the corresponding scope 1 emission existing somewhere else. So fundamentally, we need to see airlines reporting this more regularly and at a widespread level to be able to do that. And I think that not only the role that the corporate customers can play in helping to make that call to action, but the general awareness and public literacy on the issue of aviation contrails is also important. We saw that be hugely motivational in those efforts to get a net zero target in place. It coincided at a time when the public awareness of aviation's climate impact was very high. The flight shaming movement was just picking up it's real, catching wind and gaining momentum. And I know that even if we can't measure that directly, that indirectly had a role that played in setting voluntary targets within the industry and seeing greater action. So I think that it is difficult to imagine a world in which an airline would voluntarily want to talk about something that no one else is asking them to talk about.
Okay, so Jan, end of the year, you get summoned by your board to make a proposal as to the climate target or as to the reporting of DHL. How do you convince your board to put in place a non-CO2 or contrail reporting?
I'm afraid that's going to be a short meeting. It's very difficult. So let me start by sort of stating the obvious, but I mean, this room is the mother of all bubbles, right? We know what we're talking about, but if you go outside and ask 100 people what contrails are, good luck with that. And even if you go to airlines, I mean, if I look at our airline organization, also in the executive positions, they don't know much about the problem. They might know that some issue exists, but what you can do about it and what the options are. There's not a lot of knowledge on that, and voluntary action is quite difficult because there is currently, we have zero pressure from our customers to report anything. We have zero or close to zero pressure from, let's call it, the broader society. So there are no media outlets that write big articles on the failure of the aviation industry on contrails. There's really no pressure that we can feel currently that makes us want to do anything. And then ultimately, we do, as I said, most of my time goes to sustainable aviation fuels, and almost all of that is voluntary. So we do a lot of voluntary sustainable aviation fuel use, and that is all because we can use that to deduct that from our carbon footprint and use it to achieve our science-based target. So the Science-Based Target Initiative is really sort of the North Star of all voluntary climate action, right? A lot of companies use SBTi to set science-based target and then try to reach it. And it's simply not, contrails are simply not part of that. So in my view, if you're really serious about making voluntary actions on contrails, try to put it in the SBTi framework and make it count in that way. I think that will be the best way to go, honestly.
Well, great. So we have a piece of homework on ANSPs, a piece of homework on the SBTi. Now, I want to conclude before we go to questions. I'll give 1 or 2 sentences each. We've opened the packaging to Pandora box. Now we have to open Pandora's box. Credits. For or against credits on contrails as a voluntary action that can drive incentives? Andrew, we'll go in that order.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to a previous comment that that we can't see. I can't see a world in which we scale up and see a lot of corporate activity on contrail credits or contrail certified outcomes until there is accounting and reporting of the actual impact. So you have to start with measuring and actually disclosing the full impact of aviation before we can credibly see a market for contrail avoidance, avoid potential accusations of greenwashing or of what I've heard described as optimistic accounting.
I mean, I hate to use the word uncertainty.
For the 103rd
Yeah.
time. Who is counting?
But I will say I think it's too soon. And I mean, I think, Andrew, you set that up very well. We need to start with the accurate accounting and reporting before we even start to get to a world of credits. And then I will also note that as that discussion gains steam, which I think it undoubtedly will, we need to be sure that we are always centering the potential for credits for contrail avoidance in a way that doesn't allow them to be used as a trade-off for in-sector mitigation. These must be additive, they can't be in place of.
Okay, so on credits, I think I'll have a little bit more positive message. What's important when it comes to credits is to get a few things right. First, the baseline, basically. What is your baseline? And this has to be justified through a methodology, then through projects. So you have two-level justification. I'm speaking really about carbon credits, like carbon equivalent credits. Second, additionality. So basically, in the world of carbon credits is the principle of being able to explain that the project will not take place in the absence of the incentive provided by the carbon credit, being financial or other, meaning in terms of their barriers, like common practices barriers, etc., and you're basically able to justify and to explain that because my project is in place now, this allows for additional mitigation that will not have happened without this project. So if we have this in place, I think definitely I'm open to any type of credits, including contrail avoidance related credits, but this has to be in place. And just maybe to finish on the voluntary action, and I've heard because there was also going full scope, etc. Just quick reminder, so it's not voluntary. In the MRV, we already have long haul in terms of outermost regions right now. Okay, so just we have long haul starting 1st of January 25 when it comes to outermost regions. In 27, 1st of January, it will be technical automatic extension. That is not negotiable, basically. So, but yeah, so and then of course, so for voluntary action for me, it will mean that airlines that do want to do already right now long haul beyond outermost region obligation, they can still do it, and the IT tool obviously will calculate this.
Thank you.
I think it is important that there is both a carrot and stick, to take it back to the title of this panel. I think if we are not looking at credits, but looking within the scope of the other regulations that could be brought in, I think ensuring that there is a balance between making sure that airlines are paying for the full impact of their emissions, but also using the carrot to incentivise action on contrails is really important and it should be considered.
Credits, I like the concept in general and in theory. I tend to agree with Andrew and Anna. It's probably too early, and main reason is greenwashing. As I mentioned, we have close to zero pressure on doing anything on contrails, but we have a lot of pressure on not doing greenwashing. Just as an example, we have a lot of electric vehicles and they have sort of little green leaves as an emblem on them to mark them as electric vehicles, and now we're forced to remove them in the Netherlands because that is considered greenwashing, you know. And if even those little, you know, pieces in the communication are considered greenwashing, I don't even want to know what a contrail credit might do to a reputation in that field.
Well, that was very clear. Thank you all. I'm turning to the room and to the organizers because we took off late and we had to avoid a few ISSRs on the route. So is our landing slot 3:40 or 45? Good. I like that. Turning to you. Any questions, comments, short comments? Vincent, and then Larissa.
Thanks very much. I have a short question that kind of combines this session with the the previous input we heard from the previous session. If we see the cost of mitigating these contrails is relatively low, and they can be relatively assigned to some of these flights, would that allow for would that allow for a carrot that is relatively cheap and can therefore be looked into in more detail? Because you can say that it's relative to very many other carbon reduction initiatives or warming initiatives, it's relatively cheap.
Do we group questions? Oh, too much responsibility. No, you go. You answer, and then we'll take Larissa's question. Prepare your next questions, please.
All right. Okay. So this one, obviously, it is important to have studies in this regard. So there is the economic cost, social cost, environmental cost. Sorry, I'm talking already in impact assessment kind of language. I should not, because it's only if appropriate. But no, definitely. I mean, having more studies and having material assessing this is always important. I'm not saying that this will give better chances to pricing mechanism. Okay, let's spell it out. But I'm just saying that it's useful information for sure.
I would just add that that additionality is a core component of any market-based approach to environmental attributes, carbon markets, whatever it may be. I think what I'm hearing from you, Vincent, is a question of, is it truly showing financial and economic additionality if it is such a low cost potentially? I think those two things are somewhat independent, and I think that despite the fact that we do see potential low estimated costs per ton of carbon equivalent, shouldn't necessarily be viewed as the definitive answer on whether or not these things could be considered additional or not. So I think in some ways we are talking about doubling the size of the problem that this sector needs to deal with. And so if we also were talking about mitigation costs that were also nosebleed costs, similar to what we see with hydrogen aviation or with SAF, that would be almost a non-starter. So in some ways, I'm quite happy to know that we've got an uphill battle to get an entire value chain to admit and own up to a doubling of its impact, but that comes with the promise of a solution that is quite affordable from a relative basis.
Okay, no more comments. Let's take a few more questions. Please, there's lady here.
So this is more of a comment, but it's open to a question as well. Larissa Houston from Flight Keys. Prior to joining the aviation sector, I was actually, I have a legal, political science and economics background, so I'm more of the political recommendations and policy side as opposed to the science and technology side. But I think the concern is still the same, kind of coming from this side of the bridge, so to say, is that there's a gap between policy recommendations that are submitted and what ends up being executed at the end, and getting all parties on board when it comes to policy recommendations. And I think that's what creates the anxiety from airlines, from industry, from scientists on one side. It tends to become an us versus them mentality. And this is the problem that comes with any sector, regardless of where you're in. I was in climate and energy before joining aviation, and that was the same problem. So my question is, especially in aviation, I mean, this willingness of everyone in this room to come together and attend such a conference and have the ability to have these discussions, when do these discussions go from being passive to being active? And what are the procedures that are being implemented? Maybe, Dimitar, this is a question more specifically for you, but what are the procedures that are putting forward active knowledge, active learning, that can then be implemented into a solution that makes a difference for everyone? Because the problem then becomes when you have the policy, when you have the report, when you have something at the end and no one wants to implement it, or people are looking for shortcuts, or people are looking for ways out, you need everyone at the table to agree before it begins for it to be active. So I think my question for you, just to sum it all up, is how do we get everybody a seat at the relative table for us to make this solution more actionable in the end, as opposed to it being a we're waiting we'll see how it goes.
It's a very encompassing question. How we ensure a buy-in from all stakeholders? I mean, through this kind of events first, but basically through dialogue. And obviously within the EU we have a very elaborated process for consultation of stakeholders. That is, we have the climate change expert group. For member states we have the task forces. We have actually now an ad hoc group on non-CO2 for member states that is really dedicated to the topic. And it's difficult to answer with a kind of miraculous solution to this. It's always like that when you have a constraint from a policy. It's just the name of the game that the sector will respond with challenging this and in order to move things forward. But basically, it's to put it short, greater dialogue, transparency, and to just give a very quick example for the MRV, we heard a lot that it is a black box tool. That the parameters, that the models, the way they function, what you put precisely are unknown. Now we have a reference set of technical specification documents that was circulated to one of these expert groups. So one has to apply to be a member of these expert groups in order to be able to participate in more active discussion. And typically this document is going into this detail, trying to be transparent as much as we can, explain what will be the specific parameters, metrics, like how information will be expressed, the definition of this numerical weather prediction model that we're going to have, and etc. I mean, all these kind of things we're trying to be as transparent as possible, also to allow people to replicate and to create their own approaches that could be then submitted to be used instead of. So,
anybody want to add a short answer, Anna?
Yeah, I think very quickly, and just taking your sort of bigger picture question, then moving from passive to more active. I mean, I don't think there's a single answer, but certainly things that came up on the panel today, greater awareness about contrails, I think both their impact, but again, the really exciting opportunity this is, especially in a space where climate solutions are increasingly difficult to implement. And then again, I think leveraging the first movers that are that want to act on this, and again, using that initial voluntary action to then give the space to policymakers by showing them that yes, there's interest, there's appetite, and these are the ways we can really address this problem. And now, you can go and enact the policy and regulation needed to bring those laggards along as well.
Well, the bad news is we're out of time. The good news is that there's free coffee. Right? That's the next thing. So just what you say, Larissa, that was, in my view, a great point. And I think turning to the organizers here, let's hope that next time we do this conference, instead of having a conference organized by some in London, a conference here, we do a single conference that encompasses everyone, including the industry. Maybe that's the way to start. So maybe this is a hope for next year that we can manage to all be together in the same place. Thank you for joining us on this really interesting panel. Looking forward to discussing more this ANSP topic, this voluntary topic, the crediting topic, and the last and very important one of transparency and bringing everyone together around the same table. Thank you very much indeed, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
And thanking Matteo.